When you're starting with a completely blank vimrc, it can be a little bit intimidating to know, I guess, what settings you should actually be setting. So today I'm going to go over some of the basic settings that I use, and hopefully that should give you some inspiration for basically what you want to do. So let's just jump into my config. So I'm not using regular Vim, I'm using neovim, so my config will be in a slightly different location. So rather than being in my home directory or in the .vim directory if you'd rather move it to that place, I've got mine in my .config folder, so in here, and then in the nvim folder, and it is in a file called init.vim. Everything else should be pretty much the same though, so don't worry about that. Do I have this open on a second screen somewhere? Maybe I do. Yes, I do. I'll just close that off. So first up, we have the leader key mapping. So if you don't know, the leader key is basically a generic key you can use for the start of all of your bindings. So let's just see somewhere that I'm using the leader key. So if we look down here where I'm setting my format options, I've got this as leader C. So I'm mapping the characters leader C to run this command right here. And as we saw up here, I've got leader bound to space. So you could bind this to anything. You could have that as like semicolon, colon. You could even just use a number or a letter if you really wanted to. This is basically just a generic key that you can use to put at the front of any of the bindings you want to use. And the reason you use a leader key is that so if you ever decide to move this, they'll just update automatically to whatever you set this new value to. Now, the next one is to actually use the system clipboard. So if you don't know, the way that Vim works by default is it has a bunch of different registers, which are basically little portions in memory where it can store basically things that you copy and things like that. Now, I'm not a big fan of using registers. I know someone who is super into Vim is probably going to say, oh, registers are really useful. I don't really care about them. When I copy stuff and when I paste stuff, I want it to be from my system clipboard. So that's the clipboard that every single other program on your system uses. So if I copy something from Brave, I want to be able to paste that into Vim without really having to think about anything. So what I do is I set the system clipboard to unnamed plus. Now I believe you also need to have a clipboard manager installed to do this, so something like Xclip or Excel. But in neovim, you can just set this setting and it should work perfectly fine as long as you have the required program in the background actually installed. So the next two ones I have in here are for fixing up file types. So auto command buff read buff new file. So that basically means when the buffer reads a file and when the buffer comes across a new file, what it's going to do is on this extension here, so on the .text extension, it's going to set the file type to text. The reason I have this is because occasionally LaTeX files, for whatever reason, or just regular text files, they don't actually get detected as the correct file type, and I'm not really sure what was causing this. This might have just been an old Vim problem, but I've still got this setting in here, and you could use this for anything. So if you want to have this in for, I don't know, .ms files, and you wanted it to be recognized as the ms macro for trough, then you could do that in here. So star the extension, so star basically just means match on anything, so match on the rest of the name, it doesn't really matter what the rest of the name is, dot the extension, and then just set the file type to whatever you want it to be. The second one I've got in here is for making sure my calcurs notes are set to file type markdown. So if you want to have multiple locations on this one line, you can just separate them with a comma. So you could do this for anything, so well, let's just go with that example I said before. So let's set this to something like ms, and then set the file type to ms. Now, I'm not sure if ms is actually a file type, but you kind of get the idea then. Generally, you're not going to have to do this. Most file types are detected as their correct type by their extension. Sometimes, as I said, though, you might run into problems. Now, the next one I've got in here is just to make sure that my spell check setting is set to the correct language. For some reason, I was having a bit of a problem with markdown files. I'm not really sure what was happening, but for some reason, my spell checking wasn't working correctly. But we'll get back to spell checking in just a moment. Now, the next one I've got in here, some people might not be a big fan of, but you might notice that when I'm using Vim, when I go into insert mode, it basically just centers the screen. I'm a big fan of doing this. It may get a bit confusing at the start, but once you get used to it, you'll try to use someone else's Vim who doesn't use this, and you'll be really confused about why your screen's not centering, because generally your eyes are going to float to the center of the screen, so I typically just find it a bit easier to work like this. Now, the way this works, as we saw just before, is we run the auto command. So auto command, I didn't mention this before, but auto command is basically just the way that you have a command run automatically. There's nothing too crazy about that. Then we're running it on the insert enter event on any sort of file. So we're just matching it on star here, which is match on anything. And then we are running a normal mode command. and that normal mode command we're running is ZZ. So ZZ is actually just what you press to normally center the screen. So when I enter insert mode, basically it's just going to say run the normal mode command ZZ. Now the next one we have in here is for removing trailing white space. So what exactly do I mean by this? Let's just open up a test file and just have a brief look. So if we just go over here and I start typing a bunch of stuff and I just put a bunch of spaces on the end of a line for no reason. So typically you're not going to want these spaces here. They're usually not going to be doing anything too productive. So if we just save the file here, as we see now, if I try to go to the right, none of these spaces are here. So every time I try to save this file, it'll basically just eliminate those spaces just in case it ever causes a problem in config files, for example. Typically when you're writing, it's not a big deal, but for some config files, they are really, really finicky when it comes to spaces. So generally, you're probably going to be safer by just getting rid of them. Now, what else do we have in here that's pretty useful? So here we have auto commenting. So this is a mapping that I've got set up. I think by default, auto commenting is turned on. And what I'm doing in here is when I press leader C or leader capital C, that'll actually change the setting. So leader C actually disables the commenting. Leader capital C will turn it back on. So what do these options in here actually mean? So let's just have a look at the help page and have a brief look. Basically what this is going to do is it's a sequence of characters which describes how formatting is automatically done. This is described in the FO table section. So let's go down to that. Also, I have my mouse enabled because we'll get back to that in a moment. But yeah, I have my mouse enabled in Vim. So you can hate me for that if you want to. So the C in here basically means auto wrap comments using text width, inserting the current comment leader automatically. So that the current comment leader is basically the comment character. Now the R will basically automatically insert the current comment leader after hitting enter in insert mode, and O will do the same thing, but when you press O to enter a new line. So if I press O, as we can see, that'll actually put a comment there. If we press enter, that'll also put a comment there. So that just makes Vim feel a bit more like a code editor, really. So the next one we have in here is for spell check. So if you didn't know, Vim actually does have a spell checker built into it. And the way that you enable that is basically by running spell and then setting your spelling language. Now, if we do set local, that'll basically just set it for the current file. So all of the settings I'm doing in here, I'm just doing set local just because I don't really want to modify my global settings in this case. I've got my spelling language set to ENAU because I'm in Australia, but if you're in the US, then you would set this to something like ENUS, or if you, I don't know, speak Dutch, then you would have to look up the language for that. This is the same as the language that you've set for your system. So I've got this mapped to leader S. So if we press leader S now, if we look here, this S it's saying is misspelled because obviously S isn't a word. If we press Z equals, this will basically just bring up a list of different things that we can change the spelling to. And I'm not going to change that now, but I might do a dedicated video on the dictionary and on how spell check works in Vim because I think it is really, really useful. The next one we have in here is for auto indenting. So this is also another one that is really, really useful for when you're doing programming. So leader I will enable that, leader capital I will disable that. That works pretty much as you would expect it to. I'm not going to go any further into how auto indenting works. The next one we have in here that's also pretty useful, actually this one first. So by default, when you try to navigate splits in Vim, you have to press Control W and then the direction you want to go. So I've changed that so when I press Control and then the direction, it'll just automatically do Control W and then the direction. So it's a bit easier to just navigate the splits like that. I don't know why you have to do Control W first, because Control H, Control J, Control K, and Control L, I don't believe are bound to anything too useful. So it's a bit of a weird choice to be set up like this. I don't know why it's set up like that. Now, what else do we have in here that's pretty useful? So this one right here, if I press capital S, that'll basically just autofill in the text replacement. So I don't have to write out %S// and GI. GI, basically what that's going to do is G is going to match globally, and I can't remember what I was actually doing. I think that re-enables case sensitivity, but I'm not 100% sure on that one because I've actually disabled my case sensitivity in Vim. There's a good reason for that. I'll get back to that in a moment though. So that basically just works as text replacement works. So if you don't know how text replacement works in Vim, we can say, I want to replace 56 with 67, and that'll basically just go and find every single instance of 56 and replace it with 67. It doesn't take into consideration context or anything like that, it's just a simple text replacement. So let's go a bit further down and have a look at some more settings. So as you see here, I've got my case sensitivity disabled. That is being done with this right here. So set ignore case. Now the reason I do that is just because I don't generally want to type out capitals if I don't really need to. So if I do actually want to temporarily enable case sensitivity, I do smart case. So if you do a search with a capital at the start, basically that's going to say only match on capitals then if you've got smart case enabled. But if you don't use a capital, then it'll just match on everything. Some people might not be a big fan of matching like that. Generally, I find it pretty useful though. So that's how I like to have it set up. Now, as you saw, I have my mouse working in Vim. The way that I'm doing this is through set mouse equals A. If we just have a look at how the mouse settings work, basically what A does is A basically enables it on all of the modes. If you only want it enabled on like normal mode or visual mode or insert mode, you can set it up like that, but I like to have it enabled on all modes, and basically the reason for that is I like to do scrolling with my mouse sometimes. So I don't generally click around, but if I want to, I can. Normally what I use it for though is just for scrolling. So I find that a bit easier to do. So that's how I'm going to have it set up basically. Now the next one we have in here is for encoding. String encoding used internally for the RPC communication, always UTF-8. I don't remember why I even bothered to include this because it's set to UTF-8 anyway, so I'm not sure why I included this setting. Maybe it was a thing that I needed to include for base Vim, but neovim, it looks like I don't actually need this. So I've had a few people ask me about the numbers along the side here. So this is done with this setting right here. So this set number, relative number. I believe you can also do this by going at just set relative number. I think set number, relative number was a base Vim thing. But anyway, the way that relative number works is it shows my current line number as basically the line that I'm on. And then the numbers above and the numbers below it are basically the difference from this number. So it makes it easier to do things like plus 13 and go 13 lines down, or you can go minus 24, things like that. Now, if you're used to base numbers, I can see why you wouldn't want to use it, but I find relative numbers just to look a bit cooler, really. I don't typically jump around like this. I'm really bad with Vim. I just kind of think that relative line number looks kind of cool, so that's why I have it set up like that, basically. The next one we have in here is for set term GUI colors. So if you have a terminal that supports true color, this is what you have to have in here to actually enable true color within Vim. Because by default, true color is actually turned off within Vim. I'm not sure why it's turned off by default, presumably because a lot of terminals don't support true color, but I'm not 100% sure on the reason why it's off by default. Now the next one we have in here is for setting my color scheme. Obviously, if you want something like Code Dark, you're going to have to install it yourself. But I think the Vim does come with some color schemes by default. I don't ever actually use them, but I feel like it does. Color scheme. Let's see if we can find anything on that. It probably does, but I'm not too sure on that. I like to download my own color scheme. This is basically, if you don't recognize it, it's pretty much a VS Code color scheme. I think it looks pretty cool, to be honest. The next settings we have in here are my tab settings. Now, I don't think I can properly explain how tabbing works within Vim because it's actually surprisingly complicated. If we have a look at the documentation for, let's say soft tab stop. So soft tab stop. So basically, the number of spaces that a tab counts for while performing editing operations like inserting a tab or using backspace. It feels like tabs are being inserted, while in fact a mix of spaces and tabs is used. So I will leave a link to someone who can properly explain how tabbing works down below, because all of these settings kind of interact with each other. So basically all you need to know about my settings though is that when I press the tab key, it looks as if it's two spaces. That's pretty much the most important thing about my tab settings. Now you might have noticed that I've got something in here that I don't normally have enabled, and that is this cross thing here. Now the way that you do this, I was really confused about it before, but the way you do that is with this setting right here. So set cursor line and set cursor column. So cursor line is for the line, cursor column is for the column. Now the way that you do this is with the set cursor line and the set cursor column settings. Now I was really confused about this because I've seen this in a bunch of people's Vim installs and I had no idea how they were doing it. I thought it might have been a plugin or something like that, but no, it's actually just basic Vim settings. So I would also recommend setting the highlight color for the column and also for the line. Make sure if you're using a color scheme that you set this after your color scheme, because if your color scheme has these settings in it, then the color scheme will take precedence over these settings. So if you set them second, then they're going to be set after your color scheme is actually set. I wasn't a big fan of what CodeDark did, so I did decide to change these myself. Now, let's have a look at how this first setting actually works. So we're using the highlight command, and we are running that on the cursor line. And as we can see, we have CTerm settings, and we also have GUI settings in here. So the CTerm settings are used for any terminals or any installs of Vim that don't have the set term GUI colors feature enabled. So if you do have that enabled though, you can use the GUI ones. Now the GUI prefixed options will have a couple of extra things you can do. Specifically, you can use hex colors rather than just your basic terminal colors like yellow, green, magenta, cyan, things like that. I think you can use one of the 256 colors on your terminal. I don't believe you're just limited to the regular color names, but you are still limited to that basic color palette that your terminal has access to. So I've got term GUI colors enabled, so I'm mainly going to care about these features here. So as we see here, we only have a GUI BG setting here, but we also have the option of using a GUI FG, which is the foreground color. So let's just set that and see what it actually does. So we'll set that to red. So if you're using the GUI settings, you can still use the color names, but you don't have to. Now let's open up a new instance of Vim. There's a very good reason I'm doing that rather than just sourcing the file, and that's because if you source the file, it's going to try to reload your plugins. At least that's what it does if you're using Vimplug with whatever I've got set up. So I'll see if I can try and find a way to fix that, because if I could source the file, then what I could also do is make it so when I save my init.vim, then it'll actually resource the file so I don't have to basically open a new instance of Vim. But that's not too relevant to this video. If we start typing in here, as we can see, the line that I've currently got highlighted, all the text on that line is being set to red. Now, I wouldn't recommend setting your foreground color if you're using the cursor line or the cursor column. And the reason for that is because if you use syntax highlighting, then basically it's just going to break your syntax highlighting. So I didn't show you that before, but if you do want to enable syntax highlighting, all you have to do is go syntax on. So if you're doing any coding, you're probably going to want to have this setting on. And if you set the foreground color with cursor line or cursor column, it's just going to get in the way of that actually working. Now I have two more basic settings in here that are pretty useful, and that'll be wild mode and also this one here for fixing the splitting. So let's just have a look at how wild mode works. Now, wild mode is actually really useful, and I would honestly really recommend it if you are using Vim. So if you don't know, by default, Vim actually does have tab completion. It's just not very good, or at least it's not very clear what's happening. So wild mode will basically let you do this. So as we can see, when I press tab, it'll actually show me a list of everything that I can autocomplete on. So the way that's being done is by setting wild mode to longest, list, and full, with commas between them. Commas and colons actually have a different meaning in this context. I like to do it with commas because that makes it feel a lot like bash or ZSH syntax completion. So the longest option will basically complete till the longest common string. If this doesn't result in a longer string, then it will use the next part. List will basically do as it says, it'll list all of the matches. And full, what that's basically going to do is complete the next full match after the last match the original string is used and then the first match again. So that might not be exactly clear, but basically the important thing here to mention is that it will basically just act pretty much how you'd expect normal tab completion to work if you have a list. So if you're used to working with something like bash or ZSH, it'll work exactly the way that you would expect it to work. So I would really recommend that because it makes doing tab completion within Vim really simple. So the last setting I'm going to talk about today is for set split below and set split right, which will basically fix the splitting in Vim. So you might not know what I mean by fix the splitting. So if we just open up some splits, let's open up a horizontal split. And as we can see, that split is opened below my main window. And if we open up a vertical split, that'll open it up to the right of my main window. So what happens with the default settings is the default vertical setting, it'll open up this new window in this spot, and this old window will be put over here. And with the horizontal setting, the new window will be put up here, and the old window will be put down here. Now, I'm not a big fan of that because it feels like it's kind of, I guess, displacing the main window that I was looking at before, and I feel like that gets a bit confusing. So I like to set it up like this so that when I open up a split, it doesn't move what I was working on before. Now, you might not be a big fan of that, but I feel like it's a bit easier to work with, and especially coming from something like VS Code, that's how VS Code works, so I kind of wanted Vim to behave a bit more like VS Code in that regard. So I think that's pretty much everything for the basic settings. The rest of this stuff in here, I think, is basically just for my plugins, so I'm not going to go into that today. But yeah, I feel like that's pretty much everything I want to talk about. I just had a look at my recording length, and I think I've been going for like 20-something minutes, which is a little bit ridiculous, so I don't know how long it's going to be after I finished the editing, but anyway, it seemed like it ended up being a pretty long video, so hopefully you got something useful out of that if you're new to Vim. If you're not new to Vim, I hope you found something useful out of it still anyway. So, before I end the video, I'd like to thank my patrons. So I want to thank Andre, Rode, LQ, Larry, and Zil for help make this channel possible. So if you want to support the channel, or if you just want to have your name read out at the end of a video, there'll be a link to my Patreon down below. I've also got some Amazon affiliate links, so if you want to buy the gear that I use to make these videos, there'll be a link to that down below as well. I have also got my alternate video platform, so my BitTube and my library, and also my social links, so my Discord, my Telegram, and all that sort of stuff. So, two last things. Also remember to smash the like button and leave me a comment down below, and remember to subscribe and ding the little bell icon down below as well. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.